where Jesus writes to King Abgar. I don't know if you've heard of that.
No, I've not heard.
Yeah.
Tell me more about
Yeah,
this. Very much like these podcast episodes. Yeah, hopefully valuable sources, but prone to error at times.
Yeah.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Postcards from Antioch, a teaching and discipleship podcast, training. We do all kinds of things from Barton Church. And today I'm joined by Rob, who some of you may be familiar with because you've spoken before. You've done a podcast for us before. He's just come back from an extensive international speaking tour. Well, and we're very privileged, paid, no expense spared to get Rob here. No, he's been to Zambia on a mission trip. How was that?
Yeah, Zambia was great. Seems like a distant memory now, but it was. We had a really, really great time over there. Met some lovely people, and yeah,
fantastic.
Great to share that experience with church the other week as well.
Yes, and you've come straight back, and we're going to pick your brains on the Gospels. Really, we're looking at the authorship and formation of the Synoptic Gospels. That's the important sounding title. Yep. We've given this. We've done some episodes on Bible genres before, and we've touched on the Gospels before. But we're going to go quite a bit deeper, I think, than we have before in the podcast.
Yeah, possibly going to look at it from maybe a slightly different angle.
Yeah.
The podcast previously would have looked at it from a theological point of view. Maybe we could look at it from more of a historical point of view.
So those of you who may have listened to previous podcasts on the Gospels will already know what the synoptics are. But the synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark and Luke. The word synoptic, you might recognise parts of it. Synoptic, all seeing the same or from the same perspective. Really, that's where that word comes from. So Rob, so you mentioned history. Yep. We're going to be thinking about history. So what describe, define, if you like, what history is. What does that mean?
Yeah, and what is history? And you think that would be an easily answered question.
Yeah, did it at school for long enough?
Yeah, exactly. And when you actually research what is history, we think it's just another term for the past.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, there's been new sort of definitions come up from historical scholars, and where those new definitions have come in, it's actually provided a new term which is now seen as an essentially contested concept. And what that basically means is actually there's no consensus agreement on what is actually history. So
that's helpful to be.
Yeah, but like I said, when you before you research that, you just wouldn't think that would be an issue.
No, absolutely.
But yeah, there's no consensus agreement on it. And I think before I researched that, you just say it's something that we can just reconstruct of the past.
Sure.
And we can look at what people write about the past, and in some instances it is just people writing about the past. But for what historians, I guess, what they have to do, what they have to ascertain is, are we writing about the past? Is it just one's representation of the past? And if someone is writing about or reconstructing about the past, is it actually true what they're writing about, or is it just a fiction of what they're trying to write about, or are they talking about actual historical events?
Okay.
So it is a contested issue, but roughly speaking, I think the easiest way to look at or answer that question of what is history would be to try and compose about the known facts and artifacts of the past. And it's just a way of looking at the data and just trying to understand to the best of our abilities on what happened in the past. Okay. And I think that gives a good sort of brief summary on what is history.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
When we're looking at documents like the Gospels, historical documents, because to historians, I imagine the Gospels are, in one sense, no different from, I don't know, Shakespeare's plays or Josephus's writings or anything like that. What sort of things do historians look for?
Yeah,
in those
so
documents?
yeah, when they're looking at manuscripts or historical documents, I guess the core sort of things that historians look for are authenticity. So they check whether that document is authentic. Are the contents of that document, are they true? And are the contents in that document, do they parallel with any other documents within that time period? And if they do, are they describing events that are similar or are they totally different? Um, they'll look for authorship, the
Hmm.
setting of the document, and likely they would look for the dates. So those are I guess, the core things that historians will look for when
Yeah.
they're assessing manuscripts or an historical document. But one thing that, when I did the research into this, and one thing that I found was that, with historians, they will view this with skepticism.
Yeah.
So they'll always, if they find a document, they'll proceed cautiously with that. They'll consult the sources that they have. They'll look for sort of non-conforming views, and they'll very much try and determine the credibility of it. But I'd say if you ever met an historian and they were a skeptic, then I'd say it's probably an occupational hazard.
Yeah. Sure.
So
Sure. So, bearing all that in mind, I suppose one of the important questions, perhaps the most important question, is uh, does it matter? Like, is it important? Should we think or be sort of worry too much about historians and their views?
yeah, well, Christianity is rooted in history, so I
Hmm.
think it is something that we should very much be concerned about. I think it's something we should really look
Hmm.
into,
Yeah.
and it's rooted in history, I guess, very much like other religions. Islam, for example, maybe not so much as Christianity, but it still does have an element where it is rooted
Mm.
in history. And if we, for example, if we look at Islam and what Islam claims, well, it claims that Muhammad received visitation from the angel Gabriel.
Hmm.
Funnily enough, very the same as Mary.
Yeah.
But it claims that Gabriel spoke to Muhammad and claimed that he was a prophet. Well, if we could disprove that or prove that Muhammad never existed, then that would discredit Islam.
Hmm.
And the same thing would go for Christianity. Christianity claims that Jesus was the divine Son of God, and he rose from the dead. Well, if we can show that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, if we found Jesus's bones, for
Yeah.
example, then that would be a defeater for Christianity.
Yeah.
It's, the resurrection very much is what Christianity hinges on.
Hmm.
But it's a huge topic. This when we look at history and we look at the reliability of the Gospels or anything within the New Testament. There are so many subjects and topics that we can review. And each time that I've learned and continue to study this, you're just continually learning.
Yeah.
It's such a vast,
Sure.
vast topic.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's my experience with most things I've studied. I think is things are always changing and
Mm.
new discoveries are being made, new ways of thinking about things, and that affects history as it does any other subject.
Yeah, and I think today's topic is a good place to start. If we assess the formation and the sort of synoptic gospels, so if we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we can review the sort of following areas like the genres of the synoptics and the authorship, the intentions of the authors, but also the dates they were written and also the sort of composition of that as
Hmm.
well.
Sure.
So it's a good starting point.
Yeah. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Gospels we're looking at, and
Mm-hmm.
like John, all the Gospels named after the supposed authors. And I know, and I think during the previous podcast we've talked about different that not everyone would agree that the Gospels are written by the named people. What do we know, if anything, about the authors attributed to the Gospels?
Yeah, so if we look, I guess in the order that they're written,
Hmm.
if we look at Matthew, well, the only Matthew that we know about from the sort of first century Christianity is Levi, the
Yes.
tax
Yeah.
collector. So he was one of Jesus's 12 closest followers and also an eyewitness. And was also an apostle. But maybe other than Judas Iscariot, of the 12 disciples, he was probably the least respected figure. He was a tax collector. He worked for the Romans, collecting custom tolls
Hmm.
and of his own people, and then sending them back to Rome. So he wouldn't have been what we would probably class as a high respected figure, probably within the 12.
Yeah.
We know that he wrote his gospel in the province of Judea, the city of Jerusalem, probably more specifically, and it was written for Jewish Christians.
Hmm.
And probably the oldest known testimony for Matthew is from the early church father Papias, and that was in the 2nd century. Now, the documents that we have of Papias are now lost, unfortunately. But the testimony that we have is actually preserved in quotations by an early 4th century church father in the name of Eusebius. And he contains sort of verbatim extracts from Papias on the origins of the Gospels as well, that's mentioned within that. And we've got one that mentions Mark, and also another that mentions Matthew. So there's also, talking about Matthew, there's also a theory that his Gospel was originally written in Hebrew.
Yeah.
Again, that's mentioned by Eusebius. We don't have any manuscript evidence of that, but it is mentioned by the early church father. And there's also another early church father called Irenaeus, and he declares that Matthew was writing his gospel whilst Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel in Rome. So that would date the gospel writings probably around the sort of 60s AD.
Hmm.
So that gives us a good overview of Matthew. If we look at Mark, well, we know that Mark's gospel was based upon Peter's remembrances, or memoirs, as it's written by Justin Martyr. He was a translator for Peter the Apostle, and he relied a lot of his information from Peter. And we know that Peter was one of the 3 apostles that was closest to Jesus at that time. Majority of scholars believe that Mark was John Mark.
Yeah.
So that's he was best known for deserting Paul
Yes.
on his first missionary journey, but again he later reconciled with him as well. Interestingly, with Mark's gospel, we know it's not in chronological order, but it's accurate in what it affirms. So
Okay.
it's another part that we know. There is, again, another early church father, Clement of Alexandria, in the late 2nd century, who declared that Mark wrote his gospel to Christians in Rome, and that was actually at their request. So again, gives us a good overview of Mark.
Yeah.
Then we got Luke. Well, actually, of the 3 synoptics, the least is actually said about Luke. We don't actually have that much information about him. But what we do have is we know that he was Paul's beloved physician. It states that in Colossians chapter 4. And he was a travel companion, sort of on and off throughout sort of Paul's missionary travels. Now, Luke's believed to have written Acts, which is a sequel to his Gospel. And this is actually really important because there's a shift in Acts from first person to third person narrative.
Yeah.
And that's really important. And the reason for that is it actually helps historians sort of locate and explain the places where Luke was actually present with Paul.
Sure. Yeah.
So we know that from that, and we know that Luke wrote particularly for Gentile believers, and that was in the regions around Western Greece. And we know from Eusebius that he confirms that Luke was from Antioch in Syria. Okay. So that gives us a good overview of the 3.
Sure.
So
you've mentioned Matthew, sort of a possible date for Matthew. What did the church fathers say anything about datings for Mark and Luke, or is that something historians have to piece together?
Yeah, I think historians have pieced that together mainly. We can kind of it's the dating of the Gospels is very much in dispute. It's quite a widely contested topic, really. Most evangelical scholars will believe that Mark was written in the late 50s. We've got Luke and Matthew in the probably mid to late 60s as well.
Yeah.
But then you have a liberal consensus that will think that Mark was written in the 60s, and then you've got or even early 70s, and then you've got Matthew and Luke written in the sort of 80s and the 90s or
Yeah.
early 90s. So again, it's a widely contested topic,
Mm.
but but one thing I would say is that what is unanimous is that they're all written in the first century. So
Okay.
I think all scholars will confirm that. And for me, that just shows that that's extremely close to the ministry of Jesus
Absolutely.
and the
Yeah.
eyewitnesses that were around at that time.
Yeah, there would have been people still alive, probably, who would be able to dispute or confirm the events
Yeah.
described in the gospel. So, all of those dates put Mark as the first. Is that right?
Yeah, but the majority view is that Mark was written
Yeah.
first. There are other theories, but
Yeah.
the majority would state with Mark and priority. Yeah.
Okay. So, I think we'll go next. This was it Papyrus?
Papias.
Papias.
Yeah.
Papyrus. Well, that's a bit close to papaya. Bit close to a fruit. Papias. So he was an early church father.
Yep.
From, did you say, 2nd century?
Yes. Yeah.
And
close to when
but all we have of his writings are from Eusebius, who was a bit later.
Yeah.
What does Papias say?
Papias says.
Papias says, I'm going to call him Papias. Papias.
There's no wrong or right on this one.
Yeah. What does he have to say about Matthew's gospel?
So like I mentioned earlier, that comes from the fragments of Papias, and we know he wrote around sort of 5 volumes of teachings of sort of Jesus's sayings, or Jesus's teachings as such. Unfortunately, they haven't survived. They've all been lost. And they're only preserved in what is called fragments. So, in other words, there are portions of that which have been preserved through other ancient writings. And like you mentioned there, Eusebius has a collection of those. But the surviving fragments that we do have are just known as the fragments of Papias. And in Papias fragment 3, verse 16, it says, so Matthew composed the oracles in the Hebrew language, and each person interpreted them as best as he could. So again, we're referring back to him mentioning Matthew's oracles or gospels as such.
Okay. Does he provide an argument for Matthew being the first gospel?
Yeah, I think all of the early church. This is the strongest argument for Matthean priority.
Because obviously the Bible, the Gospels are ordered with Matthew as the first gospel, and I've understood it's because when the canon was settled, the belief was that Matthew was the first gospel.
Yeah, and all of the early church fathers pretty much confirm that. So this is actually really important, especially if we're going to talk about the synoptic problem or synoptic puzzle, as some like to call it, in future episodes. The reason being for that is because we need to understand which writer was dependent on who for us to really understand the synoptic problem. But Matthean priority is one view that a few scholars hold. And the strongest argument for that is simply because a lot of the early church fathers confirm that Matthew wrote first, and that's pretty much been confirmed all the way through the sort of early church fathers and the fragments and the letters that we've got. But what we should be careful of is that whilst they are valuable sources, there are some parts that the early church fathers note that aren't perfect. They do make mistakes, and Eusebius makes a bit of a howler in one of his letters, where he talks about a letter where Jesus writes to King Abgar. I don't know if you've heard of that.
No, I've not heard. Tell me more about this.
So, basically, he writes a letter to King Abgar and confirms and starts communicating with him. Well,
Jesus does.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This is something that Eusebius confirms.
Yeah.
But no historian today actually believes that that's an authentic letter. But Eusebius did.
Yes.
He thought that was authentic. So we have to be careful when we're looking at the early church fathers and what they're writing. They're valuable sources, and the reason they're valuable sources is because they're writing closer to the
Yeah,
time than what we are
absolutely.
doing today.
Absolutely.
But we also have to be mindful that, these documents that the early church fathers are writing about, they're not inspired, they're not inerrant,
No.
and they are prone to making some mistakes. So we have to be cautious of that. But they
Yes.
are valuable sources. I want to stress that. We can't
Yeah.
say that they're not, but we just have to be cautious of how we view it.
Very much like these podcast episodes. Yeah, hopefully valuable sources, but prone to error at times.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, do you know why the early church fathers put Matthew as the first gospel?
We don't, and the simple reason for that is because they don't tend to provide their sources.
No.
So I mean, there's it could just be, it could just be one of those things where they've just assumed, or
Yeah,
that
that's
is
right.
just the
It's
order,
and everyone's just
Yeah.
gone along with it.
so it's just sheer speculation. It
Yeah.
could be, and that they just arranged it as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But we do have there's this Clement of Alexandria who is slightly different to the other church fathers, and he said that the order goes of Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. So we'd also have to ask, well, where did he get that idea
Yeah.
from? So it's not necessarily unanimous, but in all honesty, without knowing the sources, it's difficult to be able to tell why they've come up with that
okay.
order, to be honest.
But modern historical, so not necessarily modern, but the more accepted view, certainly the one I was taught, is that Mark was the first gospel. What was the thinking? What's the thinking behind that? Why have historians come to that conclusion?
I think with Mark's gospel, it's difficult to understand if it wasn't written first, then why was it written?
Yeah.
Because there's so much content in Mark that's not unique,
Yes.
or the content that is unique that he puts in there just isn't really significant.
Yeah.
We've got he doesn't add anything, I guess, to the other existing gospels like Matthew or Luke. So we know in Matthew we've got the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes.
You've got 3 chapters of profound teaching from Jesus, but Mark doesn't have that. He doesn't have the Lord's Prayer that we get in Luke, or another example, prodigal son. The Good Samaritan. All of these are omitted from his gospel. So it's hard to think that if he didn't write first, then why has he not included these really important parts of the other gospels? So yeah, it's difficult to think that if he didn't write first, then why did the gospel? Why was it? Part of the synoptics.
So if it's like Mark's gospel would be redundant if it wasn't the first one. Like, it's not.
Yeah, I think because of if we look at some of the unique things that were put in Mark's gospel. So if we look at chapter 7, for example, in Mark, where it reads that Jesus heals a deaf man. He puts his fingers in his ears.
Yes.
He spits and touches the man's tongue with saliva. And it's just really odd, the way that it's written and the way that it's described. And both Matthew and Luke don't include this. And you can go, another chapter forward, you got Mark chapter 8, where he spits in the eyes of a blind man, and the healing of the blind man isn't perfect. He says, can you see the men?
Yes,
and he goes,
right.
Oh no, they're like trees.
Yes.
So you have to ask the question, well, why weren't Jesus' powers working that day, or why did Mark include that and Matthew and Luke omit it? You've got another example where Jesus, on Jesus's arrest, where you got the anonymous young man.
That's right. Who leaves his clothes behind?
Again, it's just really odd.
Yeah.
It doesn't add anything
No.
to the existing gospels. And again, Mark and Luke, they don't mention it.
Yeah.
The most interesting and probably challenging verse that I've found with Mark, and it's one that Bart Ehrman, the critical scholar, uses quite frequently, and it's one that he said was the one verse that made him become more of a critical scholar than or question scripture as such. And that's chapter 2 verses 26 to 28, and that's where it talks about how David and the men were fleeing from Saul. And they were, Saul was trying to kill them, and when they show up to Abiathar, the high priest, and as Mark says it in verse 26, they ask Abiathar for the sacred bread, and it wasn't really lawful at that time, other than the high priest to eat the bread, but Abiathar gives it to them. But actually, when you go to the Old Testament, if you look in 1 Samuel chapter 21, it isn't Abiathar who's the high priest; it's Ahimelech, who's the high priest. And in the following chapter, in 1 Samuel, it does say that Abiathar is Ahimelech's son. So there appears to be a bit of a contradiction there. But we have the same event that's mentioned in Matthew and Luke, but they don't mention Abiathar.
Okay, yeah.
So it's difficult to, how do you try and resolve this potential confusion? And I think it is confusion at minimum, really. But what's more likely in that instant? Is it more likely that Matthew and Luke, they use Mark and they neglect to use Abiathar? Or is it that more likely that Matthew wrote first and doesn't mention Abiathar, and then Mark just adds that questionable name?
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Sure, yeah.
So that's a big problem, I think, for those that have Matthean priority or hold that view, because we've got these unique things in Mark, and we've got these questionable texts in there as well, which again Matthew has omitted, and yet Mark has included.
Yeah. So it's like they left out the bits that they thought, why do you put that in, Mark?
Yeah, and you get that with there's not anything to be concerned about, because you get this with all historical documents, and I think when people are using other sources, they may smooth out the text to either to improve the grammar or just to correct what may be minor mistakes.
Yes, I mean
it's not unusual.
Certainly, what I remember being taught is that Mark, his Greek's not that great. He wasn't he wasn't a particularly excellent Greek scholar.
And I think that's another strong argument for Mark and priority as well, is the internal evidence that we have with that. So when we look at these internal evidences, we can see if we look at, I'm just going to try and find an example. If we look at Mark chapter 4 verse 22, for example, you've got Jesus talking, and he says, "For nothing is hidden except to be revealed." And when you read that, it's actually a really awkward sentence. And when you read Jesus saying the same statement in Matthew and in Luke, we read, "For nothing is hidden that will not be revealed." So that just reads a lot better. It just makes more sense. So I think, again, you have to ask that question, did Matthew and Luke have that statement as it being a lot smoother, and then Mark just corrupts the grammar, or do you have it that Mark has that awkward grammar, and then Matthew and Luke just improve it?
Yeah.
So it's a good example, another good example of why most scholars this day and age will think that Mark wrote the first gospel.
Yeah, sure. So going back to Matthew for a second, you mentioned that Papias suggested that his gospel was originally in Hebrew. Obviously, the version we have in our Bibles is from a Greek manuscript.
Yes.
Hence the use of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and so on. So what was Papias's thinking? Well, I mean, what was his argument for it being written?
Well, this is
a language other than Greek originally.
Yeah, I think it goes back to when we're talking about the fragments that we're talking about from Papias, and he mentions the word, and I use the book that I've got there from Michael Holmes, which is translated on that, and he uses a term or the word oracles. So I'm just going to try and find the passage that I had.
Yeah.
Just going to go through my notes.
That's right.
So Matthew composed the oracles in the Hebrew language. So he composed the oracles in the Hebrew language. So when he's talking about the oracles, Michael Holmes there will use a translation, which is telogia. So in Greek it's telogia. So they translated that, which means oracles. So what's possible, or what it could be, is that that Matthew was writing a list of Jesus' sayings, but he wrote them in the Hebrew or Aramaic language.
Right, yeah, that Jesus would have spoken them in, yeah.
Yeah, and Matthew, being a tax collector, was probably intelligent. He was literate, so we would imagine that when he was following Jesus, he was writing these lists of sayings, and it could be that Papias has seen a fragment or a scribe or manuscript of sayings that Matthew may have written down in the Hebrew language, and it's possible that he's put this together. He's looked at Mark's gospel and he's simply supplemented it, and that could be Matthew's gospel today. That's a theory. The honest answer is we don't know where he's got that from.
Yeah.
But it's potentially that is what, that could be the reasons as to why they thought that Matthew wrote first, but what they're probably referring to is a list of maybe Jesus' sayings as opposed to Jesus' gospel.
Okay. So, yeah, maybe talking about something different to the gospel itself.
Yeah.
Interesting. So is there anything else you wanted to say about that particular discussion, the sort of the datings or the priorities of the synoptics?
I think we've gone over quite a bit on Matthean priority, maybe Markan priority. Like I said, I think majority of scholars will now are pretty. I don't want to say unanimous, because there are some that still do believe.
There are always some.
Yeah, there's always someone controversial out there that still believes that Matthew wrote first. But I would majority do believe Mark, and the simple reason being for that is just the internal evidence is just so strong.
Yeah.
That we sort of now come to the conclusion that Mark did write that first gospel. And I think the what we mentioned there about, with the early church fathers mentioning about Matthew's sayings, I think is a plausible explanation as to why they may have thought that there was that written in Hebrew and that was written first. So yeah, I think that gives us a good overview on that side of things.
Okay, well, we'll finish, I think, just by talking perhaps a bit broadly about the genre of a gospel. What is a gospel? Because at surface value, a gospel is a form of biography, I suppose, but they are very different to, for example, a biography you or I might walk into Waterstones and buy. What sort of genre are the gospels? Yeah,
so this is not something I've done a huge amount of research on, but I think when we look at the narratives of the gospels, I mean, it all sort of talks and describes about the sort of hope that's brought forward to the world. There's one man claiming to be that Son of God. He brings hope to the people. The Gospels are all full of this related detail. They're describing ordinary people, describing the events of what's happened. So I don't think it's the sort of fiction that we see from the sort of ancient Mediterranean world, like we would see with something like Homer's The Odyssey, for example.
Sure.
It's slightly different to that. So yeah, I think when we talk about biographies, I think it sort of fits within that criteria. Now, if you're looking at it from modern day standards, and yes, we could always argue that, look, they don't fit the modern day biographies. We look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Well, they barely mention anything about the early years of Jesus's life. I mean, you got Matthew that talks about Jesus's parents fleeing from Bethlehem to Egypt, and they don't return to Nazareth until Herod the Great dies. The same with Luke. He only mentions Jesus up to the age of, I think, it's 12 when he's in the temple. But other than that, there's nothing. So no modern day biographer would miss out that amount of
childhood.
Exactly. So I don't think we can maybe look at it from modern day standards, But the popular sort of proposals, I guess, today would be that of Greco-Roman
Yeah.
biographies. And
Okay.
that sort of fits in with a lot of the other ancient texts and documents that we have within that area and within that sort of era as well. Um, so yeah, I think that's
Okay.
probably where we would fit the Gospels.
So what is there a so the Greco-Roman biography, that sort of genre, what is it that makes that different from a modern day biography other than
Yeah, so I think when we view modern day biographies, we look at it very much what we would expect from the West. Well,
yeah.
Jesus didn't live in the West; he lived in the Middle East. So I think he also didn't live in our era. He lived in a 2,000
Yeah.
plus years ago. So I think it gives it a bit of an injustice to think that we can compare it to how we would do modern day
Sure.
biographies, especially from a point of view from precision. We have a lot more resources today on how we can find information. Well, back then there was so much. They were so reliant on oral traditions and written sources. So I think when we're sort of why does it fit that Greco-Roman biography? Well, a lot of the Gospels use similar styles that we would get in say, for example, a lot of the uh, ancient or books of antiquity, like the stuff we find with Plutarch or Eusebius, like we said earlier, or
Hmm.
Tacitus. We see a lot of writings where there's approximations or removing some of the less relevant details to kind of get to the point.
Yeah.
We got paraphrasing of speeches and things like that. So they were all sort of standard practices
Mm. That's yeah.
from the ancient world, and a good writer would be expected to use
Mm.
these types of narrative, I guess. And the Gospels are written in a well written style. The idea behind it is it's designed to capture and keep one's attention, and those sort of techniques that they're using is to highlight, I guess, what the Gospel writers want people to remember.
Yes. Yeah.
So that does fit into a lot of the type of books that we see in that era.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So final question then is, I think, how do we rate the synoptics?
Yeah, how do we rate them? Well, Matthew and Mark, we don't know too much about or where they get their sources from, so
Hmm.
uh, it's difficult to know, where they got the sources from and what they narrated. Now, if we look at Luke, for example, the beginning of his gospel just gives us loads of information.
Yeah.
He closely resembles that the prologues of sort of ancient histories and biographies that scholars will find most trustworthy.
Hmm.
Luke's purpose is to convince Theophilus and the churches that were reading his account of the certainty of the things that have been taught. As it's I paraphrase that
Yeah.
into the gospel. So I think if we're looking at Luke, it would be very counterproductive to think that he would falsify that account.
Mm.
I think the sources that he's got were probably oral sources
Yeah.
and written sources, for example, using Mark as a source and other oral written sources that may have been around at that time. So I think Luke is a great source. I think we can rate him highly because of what he mentions about getting his sources and the purpose of him writing that
Yeah.
gospel. But if we want to look in more specific details, I think that's going to probably take us into another topic, which maybe we can look at
Yeah.
in future episodes.
Well, I think this episode is just a kind of an introduction to some of the deeper questions. As I said in previous episodes, we've touched on a more basic level some of these ideas, but yeah, I think you've got plenty to say, haven't you, Rob?
There's a lot of information. Trying to condense
Yeah.
everything to make it, like I said earlier, to try and simplify it is quite difficult. But
So
hopefully, I've given a good account of it.
absolutely,
But
and I think there's definitely scope to come back and explore some of these things in a future episode.
great, I look forward
But
to that.
yeah. So is there anything you particularly want to leave our viewers and listeners with?
I think I touched on a couple of times about maybe Mark's gospel and probably making it sound like it's odd, it's strange, it's um, there are some slight minor mistakes that I may have mentioned there, but I really wouldn't. I hope that doesn't come across as thinking that I don't find it a reliable source, or I think that makes the
Absolutely, yeah,
Bible not being inspired or inerrant. That's certainly not what I'm saying.
yeah,
I think we just have to compare it to other ancient books or that were written within that time, and that's when I said at the beginning, looking at it from an historical point of view. That's what we're trying to do here, and trying to be objective and also open minded
yeah.
when we're
Well,
looking at it.
I think if you even if you just had the synoptic gospels themselves, you have to ask, well, why do they put things in different orders,
Mm,
or why does Mark not mention this, or why does Matthew have this, and so on, and I think even without even doing the most basic, just reading the books, it throws up those questions,
yeah,
and it's important to be able to engage with them without thinking that you're undermining the authority of scripture or anything, just by asking questions about why they're written the way
mm.
they're written.
And I think you find you actually the more you dig, the more you learn, and the more
Yeah,
you understand the Gospels. And actually, I find that actually will strengthen your faith,
absolutely, I agree.
and will strengthen the
Yeah,
accuracy behind it, because that is the whole goal is to understand, what truth is, and
yeah,
that's what the ultimate goal is. And I think the more that you do this, the more you'll unravel. So that's what I found anyway
yeah.
from
Well,
doing this.
that's been my experience as well.
Yeah,
Well, thanks very much, Rob,
great,
for
great to be
joining
here.
us and
Thanks.
for sharing that. And as I said, it's entirely possible that we may hear from you again on this subject or a related subject in another season of. But for now, that's plenty to be getting on with, I think, and thinking about. So, thank you
Great.
very much for listening or watching. And we hope you'll join us for another episode of Postcards from Antioch in the future.